The Renaissance is traditionally taken to cover the time span from approximately 1300 to 1600 in Europe. I like to focus in on the period of time from 1350 to 1550. Those 200 years is when it was at its peak. The Renaissance, all told, was a very amorphous movement. It covered diverse trends in art, literature, philosophy. But above all, what united all these trends was that man's importance, the importance of man, again, became paramount. Or as Weber says in his videos, man as the measure of all things was crucial. Now, this Renaissance didn't just happen out of the blue. There were certain origins or trends going on that led up to the Renaissance, and I'd briefly like to define or characterize some of these trends. The first would be the intellectual origins of the Renaissance, or what was going on intellectually in the Middle Ages that led up to the Renaissance. And in this respect, probably the most important thing was something that historians call the 12th century awakening, or 12th century awakening. And at that time, in the 12th century, the Western world reawakened to the classical authors. It rediscovered them. Part of the reason why it was in the 12th century was that it took a number of years for Charlemagne's educational reforms to take root. It also took a while for the impact of the Crusades and the new contact with the East to filter into the West. As a result, the West began to read some of the old Greek authors and philosophers, and they began to study them in the universities. The universities were a result of this awakening that occurred. Universities founded originally in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, later spread throughout the West. While studying these ancient authors in the universities, middle-aged thinkers came up with a philosophical system which we call scholasticism. And scholasticism is often portrayed as something very complicated, very complex, but in very simple terms, scholasticism was nothing more than the attempt to synthesize the teachings and philosophy of Aristotle with Christianity. Aristotle used reason. He used the rational mind. He used observation of nature and the things around him to explain the world. In other words, he explained the world with logic. Christianity, on the other hand, explains the world, from an entirely different premise. And that premise is faith, a belief in God as the prime mover, as the initiator of the world. Well, scholastics tried to combine these two disparate images, logic and faith, into one comprehensive philosophical system. Now, in the long run, that failed, because you can't logically explain the existence of God or the existence of miracles or saints, because that's faith. That's something out of the realm of reason. But in the Middle Ages, it was a success in the respect that it was a creative effort. It was a creative intellectual effort. And that showed that there was creativity out there, that it wasn't just kind of dead wood existing. And it was that creativity that kind of was a forerunner of the creativity of the Renaissance. Probably the most obvious example of this intellectual awakening were the Gothic cathedrals that began to be built in the 12th and 13th centuries. Clearly showed that there was some vitality in Europe, that there was some artistic creativity also going on at the same time. So in the Middle Ages, there were intellectual trends going on that proved to be the immediate forerunners of what the Renaissance was all about when it took place. We can also point out to economic origins of the Renaissance, and briefly stated, there's three here. Trade, the revival of trade, partly as a result of the Crusades, partly as a result of an agricultural revolution that allowed better productivity. And this increased trade, commerce, led to the growth of cities. City life revived in the West for the first time in almost 1,000 years. A big characteristic of that city life was the growth of banking and also the growth of a middle class, a merchant middle class. And this was crucial for the Renaissance because as merchants accumulated this money, they could invest it in banks, but they also used that money to patronize artists. Merchants were rather new on the social scale. They didn't fit in there with the clergy or the nobility or the peasantry, the traditional three orders of the Middle Ages. So somehow to prove their worth with this new gained wealth, they chose to invest in culture. They chose to invest in art. And without the revival of trade, without the regrowth of cities and everything that went on in the Middle Ages, there wouldn't have been a Renaissance because there wouldn't have been that class interested in the pursuit of the fine arts. With regards to the political origins of the Renaissance primarily originated in northern Italy, in the city-states of northern Italy. And there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, it's easy to realize that Italy was also the home of Rome. So Italy had, if you were an Italian living in Rome, all you had to do was walk out your back door and you saw the Forum, you saw the ruins there. So this constant reminder of the classical past was important in why the Renaissance began in Italy. The other reason was that northern Italy was technically under the political control of the Holy Roman Empire. Technically. In actual fact, the Holy Roman Emperor had never been able to completely control these cities. They had fought with the popes for long periods of times over control of the cities and failed. As a result, these cities were able to occupy an intermediate political position between the popes and the Holy Roman Emperors. As a result, they were more politically independent, and for the most part, they were republics. They were republics in the same sense that the Greek city-states were republics at one time. City-states that were independent, run by merchant oligarchies. They didn't have to answer to popes or emperors. They ran affairs for themselves. And as a result, that political independence of these different city units contributed to a freer political atmosphere, a livelier cultural atmosphere, a little bit more freedom. So that was kind of the political mixture from which the Renaissance sprang. And actually the Renaissance really sprang from three city-states of northern Italy. Venice, which was called the Republic of St. Mark, Milan, and Florence. And Florence, above all, was the most important of these states. It was the home of a number of important artists during the period. And it was important because in the 15th century, for a number of reasons, the Republic came to an end there. And the Medici family seized power. And the Medici family seized power in the same way that tyrants seized power in the Greek city-states. And they seized power and they enacted a reform program. And the Medicis enacted a reform program that benefited the poor people, a graduated income tax, for example. But even more important, the Medicis, in an effort to solidify their position, to make sure that they were taken seriously, enacted a cultural program. And Cosimo de' Medici and his grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, in the late 15th century, embarked on a wide-scale promotion of the arts. They bankrolled artists. They brought in artists to sculpt monuments. They brought in artists to paint certain structures. They brought in artists to design new buildings. And as such, they transformed the city, but they also gave all this incentive to artists. This creative genius was unlocked. Excuse me. And it was during this time that Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci and Raphael all began their work. The final important point I want to make about the origins of the Renaissance is something to do with the church. Now, the church was the dominant institution throughout the Middle Ages. But by the 1400s, the 15th century, that influence had begun to wane. And there are a number of reasons why. One was the fiasco of the Crusades. The Crusades, which had started out as a holy endeavor to wrest control of the Near East from the Muslim, well, that failed. In 1204, Crusaders ended up attacking Constantinople and sacking the city after a short siege. Clearly, the initial holy impulse of the Crusades was lost in the process of political economic gains. And this really discredited the papacy for a short time. Later, there were such notable achievements as the Great Schism, when there were two popes presiding at the same time, one in Rome, one in Avignon, France. At one time, there were three popes. The church also had this ongoing problem with the morality of the clergy, priests habitually taking a wife or a concubine and a couple mistresses on the side, priests having 5 or 6 different offices and never showing up. All these administrative abuses, whatever, led to a kind of growing cynicism about the power of the church. And then there was scholasticism. Because if you were a learned intellectual and you followed scholasticism to its logical end, you applied logic to the church, the teachings of the church and everything, you eventually reached the conclusion that the church wasn't all dominant when it came to intellectual concerns, that there was a different sphere of intellectual endeavor, which came to be known as philosophy. So as a result of all these different processes going on, we can say by the 15th century, the influence of the church in the life of the Middle Ages had decreased. It had decreased far enough that it allowed the Renaissance to begin. So, summing up, where did the Renaissance come from? It came out of the Great Awakening of the 12th century, the intellectual movement throughout the Middle Ages, the pursuit of the knowledge of the ancients. It came out of the increased trade and growth of cities that went along with the Middle Ages, which allowed this merchant class to develop, which was interested in the arts. It went along with the political situation in northern Italy that allowed the creation of independent city-states. And finally, it came from the fact that the church, the influence of the church, was much less by the 15th century. Thus, if you look at these, in a way, the Renaissance is no sharp break. You can't just say the Middle Ages stopped at this point and the Renaissance began. It was this kind of slow process in which the orientation, the emphasis on intellectual and artistic concerns in the West shifted away from the church. And it shifted in a way that we call humanism, shifted to humanism. And humanism originally meant nothing more than a scholar or a person who was interested in Greek and Roman literature. Someone who studied the ancient classical writers, be it Plato or Aristotle, or be it Livy and Tacitus. He studied those because of his love of what they wrote and how they wrote it, the love of pure Latin and pure Greek. In time, this interest in classical antiquity became a point of view about life, or how to live your own life. Instead of concentrating on the afterlife, instead of concentrating on getting to heaven and not hell when you died, instead of leading an ascetic, moral, upright, in accord with the Ten Commandments kind of life, humanists, because of these ancient writers, began to look at the world differently. And they began to emphasize life itself, and not the afterlife, which was the realm of the church. But they began to emphasize how you lived life, They began to emphasize the beauty around you, the beauty of the individual human form, the beauty of nature, the world itself. And this was an important shift from the afterlife to the present day world. With regard to the ancients, humanists searched through their writings for guides to life, how to live life, models of action, or what was wisdom, or what was important in life. Because all these people had pondered these questions at one time, the answers to which had long been forgotten. But now they look to these classical authors for stimuli to change things, for a new outlook on life. With regard to the Middle Ages, their immediate predecessors, humanists rebelled against scholasticism. They said it was worthless, these petty logical arguments that scholastics got involved in. Who cares if it's the chain pulling the dog, or the chain pushing the dog, or the dog pushing the chain, however that old scholastic argument goes. It's a logical, petty triviality. It doesn't matter. Who cares about the discipline, the kind of strictures that the church had put on your behavior? What was important for the humanists was the material world, the individual. That was what mattered most for them. In a sense, these humanists made the worship of the human body kind of a cult-like thing. Humanity, the cult of humanity, the dignity of man was what was extremely important for them. And this fit very much into our emphasis on the worth of the individual in the West. Because now humanists distinguished individuals for the first time. And this was crucial. Because the Middle Ages was different on this respect. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as individual. Everything was part of a community. And that community could be the church. That community could be your manor, your serf village. That community could be the guild in which you were a member. But you're always part of a larger whole. And that was clear when you thought of like how you got into that position. In the Middle Ages, if you were a duke, your son was a duke. If you were a priest, you couldn't have a son that was a priest, but someone in your family became a priest. If you were a serf, you became a serf. If you were a dye maker, your son became a dye maker. Everything was fixed by your family birth, your hereditary. There was no individual choice in what you were going to do with your life. But now that was differently as a result of the Renaissance. For example, Michel Montaigne, the French writer, said that you could do anything with your life. Be educated. Once you're educated, you choose your own profession. You choose your own vocation for your life. You don't have to follow in the immediate footsteps of your family. You're an individual. You make your individual choice. That was also evident in all the writings, the literary works produced during the Renaissance. Because all these works now centered on heroes, individual figures in the heroes, not some large-scale community of action or whatever. And even in religion, in the church, during the Renaissance, individuals became distinguished. And this is kind of weird, but what happened was in the 15th century, the church was rocked by a number of heresies. And as a result, the church began to distinguish between members of the congregation as to whether they were taking part in this heresy or not. And when you went to confession, before, for the most part, confessions were mass. Everybody in the congregation went to penance and did penance and went to confession. But in the 15th century, the church began to single out people. You went to confession and you looked at the little list of sins and you read off the little sins that you did. You as an individual did these sins. And the church punished you as an individual. And this was part of the church's attempt to stamp out heresy and enforce its doctrinal beliefs. But in the process, it kind of reverberated and reinforced this growing sense of individualism in the West. Excuse me, because when you looked at these, you said, wow, I didn't do that. I could have done this. And you had a new sense of, you as an individual committing these sins, not as you as part of this larger obscure church community or whatever. So humanism, the overriding sense of what the Renaissance was a rediscovery of humanity, a rediscovery of the sense of the individual, of the human being.